There's something happening between you and God right now that has nothing to do with whether He's listening. You've prayed. You know you have. Not the kind of prayer where you just go through the motions, the real kind. The kind where you got on your knees with your whole heart exposed and said everything you were afraid to say out loud. You've cried in a way you didn't know was possible. You've begged with a sincerity that no one who knows you has ever seen. And you've waited. You've watched. You've looked for the smallest sign that something, somewhere, shifted. And nothing moved. At least nothing you could see. And here's what that silence has done to you that nobody is talking about. It hasn't just frustrated you. It started to make you question something far more dangerous than whether your husband will come back. It started to make you question whether God is actually there at all. Whether prayer works. Whether you are somehow the exception. The one woman whose prayers rise to the ceiling and stop. That specific feeling, not just sadness, not just waiting, but that quiet terror that maybe you're praying wrong, or that something about you is blocking this. Padre Pio knew that feeling. He saw it in the faces of hundreds of wives who came to his confessional in San Giovanni Rotondo with exactly that look. The look of a woman who has done everything she knows to do and watched the silence answer her back. And what he told those women changed everything. Not because it was encouraging in a generic way, because it was specific, because he named something they couldn't see, because he revealed that the silence wasn't what they thought it was, and that between them and the answer to their prayer, there were 3 invisible walls that no amount of human effort alone could move. But that with the right prayer, prayed the right way, those walls could come down. One by one. That is what this video is about. And I need you to stay with me all the way through because there's something that comes later, something Padre Pio asked of the wives who had been praying the longest without seeing results, something that at first sounds completely backwards, something that creates more internal resistance than anything else in the entire process. That is exactly the instruction that breaks the final wall. I'm not telling you yet, but when you get there, you will understand why everything you've tried until now has been hitting something you couldn't see. Stay with me. Padre Pio spent 50 years in a confessional listening to the impossible. Marriages destroyed. Husbands who had vanished emotionally, spiritually, physically. Wives who had prayed until their voice was gone and their faith was worn thin. And in those 50 years, he developed an understanding of why some prayers seem to go nowhere that has nothing to do with God's willingness to hear and everything to do with something that forms on the praying side of the conversation. He called them walls. Spiritual barriers that a wife builds without knowing it. Not through sin, not through weakness, but through the very intensity of the pain she's carrying. And the heartbreaking thing is that those walls are invisible from the inside. You can't feel them. You just feel the silence on the other side. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly what those 3 walls are, how they formed without your realizing it, and what Padre Pio taught to break through each one. And I'm going to give you a specific prayer for each wall, 3 prayers, not one, because Padre Pio was always very clear. A general prayer for a specific problem is like using the same key for 3 different locks. It doesn't work. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it honestly. When you pray for your marriage right now, when you close your eyes and bring your husband before God, what is the primary feeling underneath the words? Is there something in what I've described so far that you recognize in your own prayer life? Something that names what's been happening that you haven't been able to put into words? Tell me in the comments. You don't have to share any details you're not comfortable sharing. Just that recognition. Just that moment of yes, this is exactly it. Because the comments here aren't just a comment section. This is a community of women praying through impossible things. And your honesty there is an act of courage that reaches more people than you know. And now, let's get into what Padre Pio actually taught about the root of all of this. The first wall is the one nobody wants to name. Padre Pio called it the wall of the wound praying instead of the wife. Here's what that means. When your marriage started breaking down, when you first understood that your husband had emotionally left, or that there was someone else, or that the man you knew had become someone you couldn't reach. Something happened to your prayer that happened so naturally, so gradually, that you never noticed the moment it shifted. Your prayer stopped being a conversation with God and became a negotiation driven by pain. Not because you're weak, not because you're doing anything wrong, because you are a woman in agony, and the natural language of agony is urgency. And urgency, when it drives prayer, does something to the prayer that blocks its deepest power. Padre Pio knew this. He saw it 1,000 times. A wife would come to him, having prayed for months, sometimes years, without seeing movement in her husband. And he would listen to her describe her prayer life, and then he would ask her a question she hadn't expected. Not, "Are you praying every day?" Not, "Have you gone to Mass?" He would ask, "When you pray for your husband, what do you want most? For God to act, or for your husband to change?" And most wives, when they were honest, had to sit with that question for a long moment. Because the answer was almost always the same. What they wanted most was for their husband to change, to come back, to leave her, to see them again, to be who he used to be. And that desire, that aching, desperate, entirely human desire, had become the engine of the prayer. And the problem with a prayer whose engine is desire rather than surrender is that it arrives before God carrying the weight of a demand. And a demand, even a loving demand, even a heartbroken demand, creates a different kind of conversation than a prayer. Padre Pio used an image that stayed with everyone who heard it. He said that a prayer driven by the wound is like a letter written in ink that has already dried before the envelope is sealed. The words are there. The intention is real. But something about the way it was written has hardened it into a form that doesn't breathe anymore. And God, who answers living prayer, prayer that has breath and movement and surrender in it, receives that hardened letter and can act. But the action is slower, the pathway is narrower, because the prayer itself has become a wall between the wife and the answer. Now, I need to be very clear about something here, because there's a version of what I just said that sounds like I'm blaming you for the silence. I am not. The wound praying is not your fault. It is what happens to any loving human heart under enough pressure. It is not a moral failure. It is a spiritual condition, and like every spiritual condition Padre Pio ever encountered, it has a remedy, a specific one. But before I give you that remedy, I need you to understand something else about this first wall. Because there's a dimension to it that Padre Pio described that most people in this situation have never heard, and it completely changes how you understand what's been happening in your prayer life. When the wound is doing the praying instead of the whole person, there is a kind of invisible split that happens inside the wife. One part of her is bringing her husband before God with love. The other part, the part she can't always see, is also bringing the other woman into the prayer, not to pray for her, but to hold her there as evidence, as the explanation, as the obstacle. And that second part of the prayer, the part that's gripping the other woman as a problem to be removed, is pulling in a direction that slows everything down. Because prayer that grips anything is prayer that hasn't fully released control. And prayer that hasn't released control hasn't fully opened the channel through which the answer travels. Padre Pio was extraordinarily specific about this. He said, "You cannot pray for restoration with one hand open and one hand closed. What the closed hand is holding is exactly what's delaying the open hand from receiving. That's everything. Right there. Now, here's the first prayer. And before you pray it, I want to give you a specific instruction that Padre Pio gave to every wife who came to him with this particular wall. He said, place your right hand over your heart before beginning. Not as a gesture, as an act of intention. As a way of telling your body and your spirit that what you are about to pray is coming from the deepest part of you, not from the surface of your pain. Hold that position for 3 slow breaths before the first word. And then begin. Father, I come to you not with my wound in front and you behind it, but with you in front and everything else behind. I name the pain I carry. I do not pretend it isn't there. My marriage is broken. My husband is far from where he promised to be. My heart has been carrying a weight that some nights feels unbearable. And yet, I choose in this moment to pray not from the wound but from love. Love for my husband. Love for the man you designed him to be. And surrender, real surrender, not the kind I perform but the kind I ask you to build in me, of the outcome I have been gripping. I open both hands. I release the image of how this has to look. I release the timeline I have been holding. I release her. I release him to you, and I ask not that you give me what I want, but that you give my husband what only you can give him, and that in giving him that you restore what was promised. Through the intercession of Padre Pio, who knew this pain and prayed through it for 50 years without giving up. Amen. Pray that tonight with your hand over your heart, all the way through, and notice not what changes in the situation, but what changes in you after you pray it. Because the first movement is always internal. Always. Now I want to tell you about a woman who came to Padre Pio in the late 1950s. She had been praying for her husband for 2 years. 2 years of daily prayer, of masses offered, of rosaries said in the dark while her husband was somewhere she didn't want to picture. She was not a woman who lacked faith. She was a woman whose faith had been praying so hard for so long that it had gradually, without her noticing, become a kind of iron grip dressed in the language of prayer. She described her prayer to Padre Pio. She was specific, detailed, honest. She told him exactly what she asked God for every day. She told him how she visualized her husband coming back, how she had specific words she repeated, how she had made promises to God about what she would do if he answered. And Padre Pio listened to all of it with the patience that everyone who knew him described as something that felt less like human listening and more like a different quality of presence altogether. And then he asked her the question she didn't expect. He didn't ask about her husband. He asked, "When you imagine your husband coming home, is he happy?" She stopped. She had never asked herself that question. In her visualization, in her prayer, in everything she had been building in her mind for 2 years, her husband came back. He was there. He had returned. But in all of that, she had never once stopped to picture whether the man she was praying for was at peace, whether he was whole, whether the return she was asking God for was a return that would actually heal him or simply resolve her pain. And as she sat with that question, she began to cry. Not because the answer was no, but because she realized she had been praying for a version of restoration that had very little room in it for her husband's own inner life. She had been praying for his body to come home while having almost no prayer for his soul to be healed. And Padre Pio, who could see the interior of things with a clarity that defied explanation, had named in one unexpected question the invisible wall that had been standing between her prayer and its answer for 2 years. He said to her, "Begin praying for his healing, not his return, his healing, and watch how, when you pray for the right thing begins to move." She changed her prayer that night, and within 3 months, something shifted in her husband that she described as watching a man wake up from the inside. He didn't come home that month, but something in him had changed, something she could feel in the rare conversations they had, something that had loosened in the place where she had been feeling a wall for 2 years. Do you recognize something in that story? Not necessarily the exact circumstances, but the shape of it. The prayer that has been running for so long in a particular direction that it has started to calcify. The request that is real and loving and human, and yet slightly off-center from the thing that would actually move everything. That slight off-center is the second wall. Padre Pio called the second wall the wall of the wrong address. And this one is more subtle than the first, which is why it stays up longer. Here's what he meant. When a wife prays for her marriage, she is almost always praying for the right outcome in the slightly wrong direction. She is praying for her husband to return, for the other woman to leave, for the affair to end, for things to go back to how they were. And every single one of those desires is understandable. Every single one of them is human and real and comes from a place of genuine love. But Padre Pio taught that those prayers, because they are aimed at external outcomes rather than internal transformation, are going to the right God with the wrong address. And a letter sent to the right destination with the wrong address doesn't arrive. Or it arrives late. Or it arrives incomplete. Because the postal system of prayer, if you'll allow Padre Pio's kind of earthy imagery, routes everything through the interior before it reaches the exterior. You cannot change what's happening between your husband and another woman by praying only at the level of what's happening between your husband and another woman. The roots of that are deeper. Much deeper. Padre Pio knew this. The root, and this is the theological heart of everything he taught about marriage restoration, the root is what he called the void. Not in her, not in you, in him, in your husband. There is a void in your husband's heart that has been there longer than the affair, longer than the emotional withdrawal, longer than the moment you first felt him becoming unreachable. That void formed when he lost contact, gradually, almost imperceptibly, with his own sense of purpose, with his faith, with the man he believed himself to be when he was at his best, with the role he was supposed to occupy in his home, his family, his own story. That void cries out, it searches to be filled. And the enemy, who has been studying your husband far longer than you've been praying for him, knows exactly what shape that void takes, and sends into his life whatever will fill it temporarily, whatever will numb the ache for long enough that he stops being able to hear the deeper call underneath it. The other woman didn't create that void. She arrived into a void that was already there. And that is not an excuse for what happened. It is a diagnosis. And a diagnosis, unlike an accusation, has a treatment. When you pray for the void, when you aim your prayer at the root rather than the symptom, the entire landscape of what's possible changes. Because now you're not asking God to move pieces around on the surface. You're asking God to fill something in your husband's soul that no woman can fill. And when God begins to fill that void, when your husband begins, at some level he may not even be conscious of yet, to feel the thing that was missing start to return, the pull toward the other woman begins to lose its power at the root. Not at the surface, at the root. Padre Pio described it this way. The husband who seems impossibly far is not held by her. He is held by the void. Pray for the void, and you pray for what holds him. Pray for what holds him, and you become the prayer that changes the war, not just the battle. That's everything. Remember that. Let me tell you about a second woman. This one came to Padre Pio in the early 1960s, referred by another wife whose marriage he had helped restore years before. This woman's situation had an additional layer of difficulty. Her husband had left the family home. He was living with the other woman openly. Their children knew. Her family knew. The situation, from every visible angle, looked irreversible. She had been praying for him to come back for 8 months. Every day, sometimes twice a day. She was faithful in a way that would move anyone who knew her. But her prayers had a very specific shape. She was praying against the situation, against the other woman's presence, against her husband's choices. Her prayers were powerful and sincere and aimed, with the precision of someone who has been in pain for a very long time, directly at the problem on the surface. Padre Pio listened to her for a long time, and then he asked her something that seemed at first to have nothing to do with her husband or the other woman. He asked, "When did your husband stop believing he was good?" She looked at him without understanding. He waited, and then something moved in her memory, slowly at first and then with a clarity that surprised her. She thought of a period, 4 years before the affair, 5 years before the separation, when her husband had gone through a professional failure that he had never fully spoken about, a business that had failed, a decision that had cost him a great deal, and the way he had changed after that, quietly, in ways she had absorbed as moodiness or distance, was actually the sound of a man's sense of himself beginning to collapse inward. She had never connected those two things, the collapse of his interior sense of worth and the eventual affair. Padre Pio had connected them in one question. He said to her, "You have been praying for him to come home. Begin praying for him to remember who he is." Those are two different prayers. One moves a person, the other moves a soul. She went home and changed her prayer that night. She didn't pray against the other woman. She didn't pray for her husband to leave where he was. She prayed, for the first time in 8 months, for God to reach into the deepest part of her husband's interior and touch the place where he had stopped believing in himself. For God to fill the void that had been calling out for something to fill it ever since that professional failure had hollowed out his sense of purpose. Took 5 months, but the husband came home, not because anyone forced him, not because the situation resolved itself externally, because something in him shifted at a level that no external circumstance had been able to reach, and that the correctly aimed prayer had reached with a precision that still moved her to describe when she told the story years later. And I need to pause here for a moment, because if you've made it this far in this video, if you're still here, still listening, still recognizing yourself in what I'm describing, it's because this isn't the last thing Padre Pio taught about this. There's more, and each part has its own specific answer. Subscribe now and hit the bell. Every week I bring new teachings from Padre Pio about the spiritual reality of marriage and what actually moves when human effort has run out. When you hit that bell, you're the first to receive them. subscribe, hit the bell, and let's keep going, because the third wall is the one almost no one has heard about, and it's the one that explains why even correctly aimed prayers can still feel like they're hitting something. The third wall. This is the one Padre Pio spoke about least in public and most in private, in his confessional, to the women who had been praying the longest. He called it the wall of self-protection disguised as prayer. And this one, I need you to sit with this one, because it is the most counterintuitive of the three. And it is also, according to everyone who received this teaching from him directly, the most powerful one to break. Here's what he meant. When a marriage has been going through what yours has been going through, when there has been betrayal or emotional abandonment, or the particular kind of pain that comes from watching your husband become unreachable, the heart does something entirely natural. It begins to protect itself. It begins to build walls around the most vulnerable parts. Not consciously, not as a choice, as a survival response. The heart that has been broken enough times begins to hedge, to guard, to prepare for another disappointment. And that guarding, which is entirely human and entirely understandable, begins at some point to enter the prayer itself. Not in the words. The words still say, Lord, restore my marriage. The words still say, bring him back. The words still express hope. But underneath the words, in the part of the prayer that never gets spoken out loud, there is a quiet, almost unconscious preparation for it not to work. A part of the wife that has begun, after months or years of praying without seeing movement, to believe that maybe this is the one prayer God won't answer. Maybe this is the one exception. Maybe she is protecting herself from a hope that has cost her too much already. Padre Pio could see this. He saw it in the posture of the women who sat with him, in the quality of their voice when they spoke about prayer, in the specific way pain had rearranged their faith from something open into something armored. And he was extraordinarily gentle about it. He never accused. He never said, you don't really believe. What he said to several women in different ways, but always with the same essential truth, was something like this: your prayer has a roof on it, and God's answer needs to come from above. Lower the roof, or better, take it off entirely, and pray without protection. Pray without protection. That instruction is harder than it sounds, because praying without protection means allowing yourself to hope fully, again, when hope is the very thing that has cost you the most. It means standing before God with every wall down, including the internal ones, and saying, I believe this is possible, without the invisible asterisk of, but if it isn't, I've already half let go. It means praying as if the answer is already in motion, not as a technique, as an act of genuine, terrifying faith. This is the thing Padre Pio asked of the women who had been praying the longest without seeing results. And I told you at the beginning that there was something in this video that would seem impossible at first, something that creates more internal resistance than anything else in the entire process. This is it. Not the prayer for the other woman that comes later. The instruction to lower the roof, to pray without the invisible protection you've built between yourself and another disappointment. Because here's what Padre Pio understood about that wall of self-protection that makes it so important. It doesn't just limit the prayer from reaching God. It limits what God can bring back through the prayer. Think about that. An armored heart can't receive a full restoration. Because a full restoration, the kind where the husband doesn't just come back physically but is genuinely, spiritually transformed, genuinely different in the way that makes the marriage not just restored but better than it was. That kind of restoration requires a wife whose heart has been opened enough to receive something larger than what she lost. And a heart that has protected itself against disappointment has also, without meaning to, limited its own capacity to receive fully. Padre Pio said it this way: the woman who prays with one wall still standing will receive a partial answer. The woman who prays with all walls down will receive what she could not have imagined asking for. That's the promise. Not my promise, his. And Padre Pio didn't promise what he couldn't deliver. I want to tell you about a third woman. This one I want to describe very carefully, because her story is the one that carries the most unexpected twist of everything in this video, and it's the one that explains the instruction that seems impossible. She had been praying for 4 years. For years. Her husband had been involved with the same woman for most of that time. He had left briefly, returned, left again. The pattern had repeated 3 times. By the time she came to Padre Pio, she was not a woman who had given up on prayer. She was a woman who had become, without realizing it, a professional prayer. Someone who had learned all the right words, all the right postures, all the right prayers, and whose prayer had become so practiced, so polished, so carefully constructed that it had lost the one quality that makes prayer irresistible to God: vulnerability. She was praying expertly, and she was praying safely. Every word was correct. Every intention was sincere. But underneath all of it was a fortress built over 4 years of betrayal and disappointment, and that fortress was not just protecting her heart. It was protecting her prayer from the one quality it needed most. Padre Pio listened to her for a long time, longer than usual, and then he asked her something that she later described as the question that broke open 4 years of careful, armored living in a single moment. He said, "Tell me one thing you're afraid to want, because you're afraid wanting it will hurt you when it doesn't happen." She was completely still for a long moment, and then she said very quietly, "I'm afraid to want him to love me again, the way he did at the beginning, because I don't believe it's possible anymore, and wanting it feels more dangerous than everything else I've been carrying." And Padre Pio said, "That is your prayer, the one you just told me. Say exactly that to God. Not the prayers you've been saying, say that one. The one that costs you the most to say. That is where God is waiting to meet you." She went home and prayed the most terrifying prayer of her 4-year journey. Not polished, not constructed, not expert. She told God, with everything she had and everything she'd lost and everything she was afraid to want, that she wanted her husband to love her again, the real way, the way it was at the beginning, and that she didn't know if it was possible, and that wanting it was the most frightening thing she had ever done. And she prayed it without protection, with the roof entirely off. Within 6 weeks, her husband called her. Not to negotiate, not to continue the cycle. He called her because something, and he told her later he had no explanation for it, had begun happening inside him that he described as feeling like he was waking up from something. Like a fog was lifting, like he was being pulled back toward something he had lost and was only now beginning to remember. He came home 2 months later, and he never left again. Padre Pio knew this. And now, this is the moment I told you about at the beginning. The instruction that seems impossible. The one that creates more internal resistance than anything else. The third prayer, the one for the third wall. But before I give it to you, I need to tell you something about why it takes the form it does. Because without understanding the why, the prayer can feel like it's asking you to perform something you don't feel. And Padre Pio was very clear. A performed prayer is not a prayer. It's a speech. And speeches don't move the invisible. The third prayer, the prayer for the wall of self-protection, requires you to do something that will feel wrong at first. It requires you to pray, not for your husband to come back, and not against the other woman, and not even primarily for the marriage to be restored. It requires you to pray for God to open your own heart, to widen it, to remove from it the careful, invisible limits you've placed on what you're willing to hope for, on what you believe is still possible, on what you're allowing God to do. You are not praying to change Him. You are praying to change the capacity in you that will allow you to receive the change in Him. That's the counterintuitive part. That's the instruction that sounds backwards. And Padre Pio said it is exactly the one with the most power over everything else. Because when a wife's prayer becomes genuinely open, genuinely without the invisible roof, it creates a spiritual atmosphere around the marriage that is qualitatively different from anything that armored prayer can create. And your husband, even at a distance, even in the middle of whatever is holding him, feels that atmosphere change. Not consciously, not in a way he could explain, but something in him begins to respond to a different quality in the space between you. That is not magic. That is what Padre Pio understood about the spiritual reality of marriage that no therapist's framework can fully contain. And now I want to pause here because right now, right in this moment, there is someone in your life who came to mind while you were listening to this. A woman, a friend maybe, a sister, someone you know who has been praying for her marriage with the same kind of invisible exhaustion that this video has been naming. Someone who has been doing everything she knows to do and watching the silence answer her back. This video can give her something that no conversation has been able to give her. The name for what's been blocking her. Send it to her right now. Not because I'm asking, because Padre Pio spent 50 years in that confessional making sure no wife who searched for help was left without receiving it. And today, in this moment, you can be the instrument that brings this to someone who needs it exactly as much as you did when you found it. Share this video with her, right now, while the weight of what you've heard is still fresh. Now, the prayers. I said at the beginning that there would be 3 specific prayers, one for each wall. Not one generic prayer, because Padre Pio was always clear. A general prayer for a specific problem doesn't have the precision to reach the root. Each wall needs its own key. You have the first prayer already, the prayer for the first wall, the prayer of releasing the wound as the engine of the prayer. Pray that one with your hand over your heart. 3 slow breaths before the first word. Now the second prayer. The prayer for the wall of the wrong address. The prayer that aims at the void in your husband rather than at the external situation. Before you pray this one, Padre Pio gave a specific instruction that he repeated to multiple women in nearly identical language. Pray this one out loud. Not in your head. Out loud. Even if it's barely above a whisper. Because, and this is important, the invisible bonds that hold your husband in the void operate in a realm where what is declared has a different quality of power than what is merely thought. And this prayer is a declaration. It needs to be spoken. Father, I come before you not to move a person but to fill a void. I know now that what holds my husband where he is was not created by her. It was created long before her, in a place in his heart that only you can reach. I pray for that place tonight. I pray for the void in my husband's soul, the place where his sense of purpose collapsed, where his faith grew cold, where the man you designed him to be lost contact with the calling you placed in him from the beginning. I ask you, not to take him from her, but to fill him with you, to give back to him what he lost, his sense of worth, his sense of direction, his sense of being a man who belongs somewhere and to someone and to you. And as you fill that void, as you give back to my husband what the void was crying out for, I trust that what no longer needs to be filled from the outside will stop pulling him there. Through the intercession of Padre Pio, who prayed for the void in the hearts of hundreds of men he had never met, because their wives had prayed for them with faith. Amen. Pray that out loud. Tonight, even quietly, the declaration matters. Now I need to give you the third prayer, the prayer for the wall of self-protection. And before I do, and before you decide whether you can actually pray it, I want to name what it's going to cost you. Because Padre Pio never asked anyone to pray something difficult without first acknowledging what the difficulty was. This prayer is going to ask you to want something you've been afraid to want. To say out loud, to God, not to anyone else, just to God. The one thing that feels too dangerous to want because wanting it opens you up to the full weight of the disappointment if it doesn't come. The full hope, unprotected. And I know that feels like the most vulnerable thing I've asked you to do in this entire video. It is. That's the point. Before you pray this one, Padre Pio's instruction was this. Pray with your eyes open, looking up. Not as a ritual, as an act of honesty with God. As if to say, I am not closing my eyes against the possibility that you don't answer this. I am looking at you with everything open, including my fear. And I am praying anyway. Father, I am about to pray the most honest prayer I have prayed in a long time. I have been praying carefully, safely, with words that are true but with a heart that has been protected against hoping too much, because hoping too much has already cost me more than I can say. Tonight I take the roof off. I pray without protection. And what I pray, what I am most afraid to want, but what I am choosing to say to you right now, is this. I want my husband to love me again. Not a version of him that is managed and monitored and handled carefully. I want the real thing. The love that was there at the beginning, the love that made promises that both of us believed, the love that I know is still somewhere inside him under everything that has covered it. I want that. I say it out loud. I say it to you. And I trust, not because I can feel it yet, not because the evidence in the visible world supports it yet, but because you are God and Padre Pio promised that a prayer without walls never returns empty. I trust that what I'm asking for is not too much. That the man God designed my husband to be is still in there. And that the void that has been pulling him away is beginning, from this night, to be filled by the only one who can fill it completely. Amen. Pray that prayer with your eyes open and your hands open. Every night for 9 nights. Not as a formula, as an act of living faith that grows a little more open with each night. And now I want you to think about your husband. Not what he did. Not where he is. Not the choices he has been making that have broken your heart in ways you'll carry for a long time. Him. The man underneath all of that. The man who, somewhere in his interior, in a place the void has not been able to reach completely, still carries the memory of who he was when he was at his best. When he was the man he promised to be. When he looked at you and saw his future. Padre Pio never prayed against a husband who had walked away. He prayed for him. For the void that had pulled him out of where he was supposed to be. For the wounds that had never healed and had expressed themselves in choices that destroyed what should have been protected. For the man underneath the choices. For the soul underneath the man. And when he prayed that way, not from the wound, not from the accusation, not from the understandable desire to see the external situation resolved, something started to move in the invisible. Something that no therapist's report and no human conversation could fully explain. Something that had to do with the real nature of prayer when it is prayed by a wife who has stopped managing her own hope and allowed it to become something genuinely, terrifyingly alive. That is who you are tonight. A wife who found this video, who listened all the way through, who recognized something that had no name until now. And the fact that you're still here, still listening, still willing to try one more thing, still carrying this marriage before God even when the silence has been loud enough to shake your faith, that willingness is not nothing. Padre Pio said that the wife who keeps praying when it costs her the most is the one closest to the breakthrough. Not because she has more virtue than someone who stopped, but because the prayer that continues through the silence has been forged in something that prayers prayed in easy circumstances simply don't contain. Hold on to that. So here's what I want you to do tonight. Before you sleep, find a quiet place. Put your phone or your device down. Place your right hand over your heart. Take 3 slow breaths. And pray the first prayer, the prayer of releasing the wound as the engine of everything. Just the first one tonight. You don't have to pray all 3 at once. The 9 nights give you time to go through them in order and to add to them as you go. Put your husband's name wherever the prayer says, "My husband," and believe even if you feel nothing yet. Even if every visible circumstance looks exactly the same as it did when you started watching this video. Even if the silence is still there and the proof is still missing. Believe that something you cannot see is being moved. That the void that has been holding your husband in a place he was never meant to stay is beginning. Tonight, at the level where prayer operates and human eyes cannot follow, to be filled by the only one who can actually fill it. And that the 3 walls that have been blocking your prayer, the wound praying instead of the wife, the wrong address, and the self-protection disguised as faith, are beginning, one by one, to come down. If something in this video moved something in you today, if there was a moment where something you heard finally gave a name to something you've been unable to name for months or years, I want to hear from you in the comments. You don't have to share details. You don't have to explain everything. Just tell me what landed most for you. What was the thing that made you think, "I've never heard it described exactly that way before," and that's exactly it. That small act of honesty in the comments is already an act of courage. And it reaches other women who are reading there and who need to know they're not alone in what they're recognizing. Give this video a like if something in it touched something real in you today. That like carries this revelation to more wives who are alone right now in their pain, searching for an explanation that no conversation has been able to give them. Every like is a wife who might find this tonight who needs it exactly as much as you did. And in the next video, I am going to reveal something that Padre Pio said specifically about the husband who is still with the other woman but has started showing small signs of internal conflict, signs his wife sees but doesn't know how to read. He left a specific teaching about what those signs actually mean in the spiritual reality of what's happening, and what the wife who sees them should do in prayer in that exact moment. You will not want to miss it, because those signs, the ones you may already be noticing, are not what they look like from the outside. And Padre Pio's explanation of what they actually are will completely change how you understand where your husband is right now. Don't miss it. Subscribe, hit the bell, and I'll see you there.